That is something that a precaster can give you advice on, but it's not always part of the precaster's contract to caulk those joints. That is going to be a maintenance issue, so 20 years down the line, 15 years down the line, they will have to be recaulked to keep the seal. Usually you're looking at about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of space in between those panels. I don't spend a whole lot of time on the connection issues because the precaster is the one who's going to create all of the connection details. He's going to actually engineer his own product. He's not going to engineer the whole building. He'll need to know the loads, he'll need to know the codes from the local area, and he'll create all of the connections for his own product. Some things to keep in mind with fabrication, delivery, and installation, just a little bit on that. First of all, how do you make precast affordable? What's going to happen? There's two things that I talk about that really make the biggest difference. There's other little things that you can do as well, but there's only two things that really matter when you're talking about the cost of precast, whether it be panels or bridge beams or anything. First of all, you want to have as much repetition as possible, and that's because of the manufacturing process. You want to be able to have multiple pieces all on that same long line bed. You want to have the same crane be able to pick them up. You want to be able to use the same drawings and engineer each piece so you're not re-engineering each piece separately. So a lot of repetition really is going to help keep the cost down. The second thing is the piece size. Do you think precast pieces should be bigger or smaller? Bigger, exactly. You want to have them be bigger because bigger will be less expensive. You want to have fewer time with the crane. You want to have the crane pick up fewer pieces of precast. That being said, you still need to be able to get the precast to the job. And as we talked about before, concrete is heavy. So there are going to be some limitations on the size. You'll also have limitations with just trucking it to the job site. In general, a wall panel is going to be limited by about 12.5 feet in one direction. In the other direction, you'll typically see about 20 to 30 feet long. And that's going to be something that they don't need any special permitting. It's pretty easy to get it to the job site that way. If you start getting bigger pieces than that, you have issues with the precaster having to have cranes in his yard that are big enough to pick up the pieces. You'll have to have special permitting to get it on the highway. So there will be issues that will come around with that. Just as we're talking about the repetition, especially when you're talking about architectural precast, they're building all of the formwork. So you want to be able to use those forms as many times as possible. You can build repetition in a lot of different ways. Sometimes you have funny looking pieces because of that. But in general, also, rectangular pieces of precast are going to be a lot easier to hang on a building than pieces like this. Panel size. In general, like we said, bigger is going to be better or less expensive. One of the things that you do need to keep in mind with the panel size is the pick price. And that's one of the reasons that you want it to be larger. Every time a crane picks up a piece of precast on the job site and puts it on the building, the contractor is going to pay a pick price. And in downtown Chicago right now, that ranges in about the $1,500 per piece range. So if you have a 1 by 10 foot column cover, that's still going to cost you $1,500. It'll cost you the same $1,500 if you have a 12 foot by 30 foot piece of wall panel. So if you start looking at the square footage cost of putting it on the building, bigger will be less expensive. There you are, getting it to the job site. It's kind of unusual to have two pieces of precast, but because they have those big punched out windows in this case, they could do it with the weight of the concrete. Sometimes too you're going to see some larger pieces. It is possible to do one of a kind or larger pieces onto a job site, but then there will be special issues that you need to take into consideration. In this case, they're tilting it on its side. One of the things that we've seen in this part of the country is a 15-foot wide double T, which is new. Most of the double Ts that you see around the country are 12 feet wide. So 15-foot wide, that's a little bit wider, and they are shipping those also on an angle as well. In an ideal world, this is what a precast job site would look like, except that it would be a precast structure in the back instead of a steel structure. But it's got this nice flat surface. It's got the crane right up next to the building. You can see the truck with the precast on it can pull up right next to the crane. And you pick up the crane and have this nice plumb line between the crane and the building, and it goes on pretty simply. So in an ideal world, that's what it would look like. In the real world, a lot of times they look more like this. You know, you might have issues with you've got water right next to the site, or electrical wires, or it's muddy and the crane is sinking into the mud. So there's all sorts of issues that have to be taken care of before you get that nice crane picking up the precast off the truck and putting it on the site. So real world versus, you know, your ideal world. Hoisting early, a lot of times when you're hoisting concrete, you do want to either think about starting at the back of the site and moving forward. Sometimes you can move around or move from the inside of the building out. The things that you want to avoid are double handling. You don't want to have to use two cranes to pick up a piece or pick it up twice. You want to avoid coming underneath something else with the precast because you're asking to just ding or chip it. Precast is actually pretty fragile. You wouldn't expect concrete to be fragile, but with the pre-stressing, you have to be very careful about how you're going to pick it up. You're never going to pick up a long beam from the center of it. It would just snap right in half. So you're always going to have to pick up the beam from the four corners. This is, we talked earlier about Soldier Field, just to give you an idea of what the erection issues were at Soldier Field building that bowl. There they are erecting from the inside, and you can really see that it was a pretty tight site. Yeah. They had, where is it? I think it's right here. They had a piece that everything came in through this one piece of the stadium. I think it was there. And they might have disassembled them before they brought them out. It's been about 3 years since I sat through a presentation on this. Yeah?
Do they ever use like helicopters and stuff?
Usually, in this part of the country, the precast is usually part of the precaster's contract. And so they don't usually use helicopters or anything like that. Now, I did have a precaster up in Milwaukee. Have you ever been up there and seen the river walk that they've built up there that kind of comes out on the river? That uses all double Ts. And that was actually an FOB. They just took the precast to the site and dropped it at the riverbank, and then they had a barge that came in and they barged it out to the site and placed it in. But the precaster didn't want anything to do with it. He just didn't feel like he knew enough about barges and water to get that erection. So that was a specialty erector. But I've never heard of anybody using helicopters for it. So we talked about this earlier, but I always like to just mention it again, that PCI certification is your good housekeeping seal of approval on your precast. And it is something that you know, to always look for when you're talking about who's going to actually do the precast on a job.